Hi, everyone, and welcome to Sedscast. It's your host, Owen Marr. Joining me today as co-host is Ross Thyne, and our guest is Casey Dreier, who is the Chief Advocate and Senior Space Policy Advisor for the Planetary Society. Casey, how you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, we're excited to talk to you. Like I said, we've had a couple different guests that are policy related, but there's a lot of new stuff going on in the world of space policy, especially with the new administration. So we're excited to talk. I guess the first thing we should probably do is just have you give an elevator pitch for what your job is and what you do.
Yeah, so I really do two different jobs. And one I think is really important. It's the demystification, in a sense, of space policy for a more general audience, for space enthusiasts, for space fans. Basically saying, translating the process of politics into what people are more familiar with every day and demystifying that process so people really can understand how decisions are made in space policy. And the second part of it is the kind of the more active grassroots organization, getting people engaged and getting them educated and getting them empowered to participate in this political system that we have in support of space exploration, to enable the kind of missions we'd like to see in the future, and to really invest in your future jobs and future opportunities for people who want to participate in space exploration. And so that's that pair, I think, is really important, that kind of education and then empowerment aspect of space through the political lens.
Could you also walk us through what got you personally interested in space in the first place?
Yeah, I think like a lot of you, I was born with some inherent interest in space. I don't even really remember what triggered it. I have an early drawing that my parents show me that I declared was a rocket ship, but isn't otherwise some abstract scrawl that I can't understand. They didn't even know how I knew that word. And so I just grew up in the 80s. So, the Voyager spacecraft were actively exploring some of the ice giants for the very first time, Neptune and Uranus. I remember seeing, that data coming down in pictures. I just loved that kind of stuff. I was just entranced by it. Carl Sagan and the work that he was doing in popularizing and, making space something vast and mysterious and exciting and achievable, something that we could actively, reduce our ignorance of, was very, kind of a wondrous feeling to participate in. And so that really got the bug, that aspect of space just was deeply entrenched in me when I was young. And then, growing up, finding a way to, try it out being a scientist, even though I never really wanted to do that professionally, really helped to have me give me a grounding in understanding the natural world. And then I always had this fascination with politics. And now I've been able to kind of marry those two interests together and really, participate in space exploration without having to really do the hard work, in a sense, of being a scientist or engineer.
That's really interesting. And I guess I'm wondering now, looking at your current role, what is the goal of the Planetary Society and how does that relate to your internal goals?
Yeah, so the Planetary Society, just big picture, we're a nonprofit organization, but even more importantly, we're an independent nonprofit, right? So we're not funded by aerospace companies. We're not funded by government grants. We're funded by people. Anyone can be a member of the Planetary Society. We have over 50,000 members around the world in about 100 countries. And that's a really rare organization to be, right? That we don't have any kind of masters to serve, in a sense, or politically or opinion wise. We can be really independent. We represent people, and that organization is, structurally, historically, we were actually founded by Carl Sagan. Lou Friedman is another founder, and then Bruce Murray, who was actually the director of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at the time in 1980. So we've been around. We just celebrated our 40th year, again, just existing purely on people's voluntary memberships and donations, which is pretty amazing. The goals of the organization, as you might imagine from being called the Planetary Society, we're particularly interested in planetary exploration, right? So robotic exploration, scientifically driven exploration of the solar system, exoplanets, humans, to Mars and to the moon. And then we've expanded a little bit more recently to really be focusing on planetary defense, right? So we take that strong position. We really don't want Earth to get hit by an asteroid, right? That's a very bold idea, I know, but it's one of those things we try to encompass more and raise that as an idea. And so the society itself does a number of different things. We do a lot of outreach and education. We do our own kind of scientific and engineering investments. We have our grant programs. We launched LightSail 1 into space, or 1 and 2, I should say, two CubeSats, solar sails. And we've been trying to kind of refine more on these kind of three core ideas of planetary exploration, planetary defense, and then also the search for life. So the scientifically motivated exploration of the solar system. So it's a really cool place to work for. And we get to kind of choose the really fun parts of space exploration to focus on. And the policy then that I get to do is kind of the policy of science, policy of exploration, and where we can invest in those as a nation and more broadly, as a global community, to really maximize and improve the type of scientific output, the type of missions we see, and ultimately, enrich and support, life on Earth and beyond.
So, can you help explain how space policy affects the future of space and the development of the space industry? What is that interaction like?
Yeah, it's space policy. I mean, it's the most important thing because, let's step back. Who funds space exploration, right? We have a private space marketplace now or economy, but they mainly sell to governments, right? That's their main customer. Since the history, since the beginning of space exploration, has been a publicly funded enterprise. And so policy set by governments, set by representative governments that are, ultimately responsive to the electorate, is profoundly responsible for the outcomes that we see, right? The policies that we set. And I'm always kind of fascinated by this idea and, this kind of weird abstraction that of people sitting around in a room thinking, about very broad things of like, I want to go to that star over there, somehow through this policy process churns through this big machine that creates bended, metal and this physical thing that is then launched into space to go to that very distant little point of light. And how you get from thoughts in someone's head to an actual physical manifestation of that idea, in a sense, is the outcome of policy, right? That either invests in the types of technologies needed to get there, invests in the jobs and resources and training that allows people to build and solve those problems, that provides the resources to pay their salaries, that even to, building the infrastructure to be able to launch something into space. These are all the outcomes of policy. And so space policy it's one of my big long-term missions in my career is to convince, scientists and engineers that space policy is a critical aspect of your future because your jobs are intimately tied to public sector investments and public sector decisions. And without those, even with a private space marketplace, or even with that, the footprint, in a sense, of government investment in space is so large by comparison that it really does depend on that kind of decisions.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And probably one of the biggest misconceptions I get from people out, like just friends outside the industry, they think SpaceX was created through venture capital or for something else, but a lot of it was NASA. So totally understand what you're saying there. As we see more of these companies that are launching commercial satellites, what are the responsibilities of the governing bodies? Like, who's responsible when it comes to launch vehicles for saying what can and can't happen? And then that'll probably push us into this conversation about protecting Earth from both asteroids and from having satellite and space debris and stuff like that. But like, where does the policy lie, and where does the responsibility lie for governing what can and can't be done with launch and with satellites?
Yeah, well, launch is governed by the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, which is in the Department of Commerce, and they grant licenses for launch. And that's probably the main one. The NOAA also grants licenses for space imagery. There's issues about how detailed your pictures can be without hitting national security issues. Those are kind of the two main ones. There's also, if you really want to get down, there's like OSHA operational, safety and hazards kind of issues of working in those hazardous environments. But there's not, it kind of reflects in a sense, it's a bit of a soup, and it's gotten a lot better over the years, the regulatory structures for this type of thing, because it used to be that there wasn't a commercial industry. And so where do you even apply for a space launch license? And this is what a lot of companies hit in the early 1980s. They didn't know who to talk to, and the agencies didn't know who they should talk to either. And the very first commercial licensing law passed in 1984, the Commercial Space Act, that started to clarify some of the regulatory structures to support private actors to pursue missions in space. And so there's still a lot of regulatory gaps, though. And that's the thing. Space is very new. Let's not forget that, right? We've grown up with it, but space is as old as some of our parents. And, the Rolling Stones as a band basically covered the space age, right? It's like they formed in 62 or something. And so it's a very new thing. So a lot of our government structures, like space is not written into the US Constitution, right? Like there's no acknowledgement of it. It's a forward-thinking document, but not that forward-thinking. And so we've had to, government perspective, figure out where space fits into this existing structure, because we don't have a Department of Space, right, in the country. And, people talk about NASA. NASA's not a regulatory agency. Their job is to go into space, right? Their job is not to regulate other actors who want to go into space. That should be a separate focus. And so finding and adapting Department of Transportation is also part of, all these areas that have to play together has been one of the big challenges over the last few decades. And they're getting a lot better at it. And Congress has been writing laws that help streamline this, that help they indemnify launch companies from being sued if there's a big disaster, right? So they don't have to carry as much insurance. There's a lot of pro industry regulations that have been coming out, in the last 20 years in order to nurture the industry.
Okay. You mentioned the FAA at the start there. There was a little bit of a fiasco a couple weeks ago with Elon going back and forth with the FAA about permits. From a policy perspective, do you think the FAA is correct in the way they do stuff now, or do they need to work on adapting to allow for more launches? Is that just a growing pain, or is there something more serious going on there?
Well, I don't. First, I'll say this is a little bit out of my general focus, so I don't know the details of the ins and outs of what was going on between SpaceX and the FAA. But there is always going to be a tension, and there should be a tension between a regulatory agency and the companies, right? Because they have two different goals. The regulatory agency, in the ideal case, is representing the public interest, right? And the public interest, kind of by definition, does not always align with the individual or company interest that they're regulating, right? So SpaceX wants to launch as much as it wants to, whenever it wants to, as fast as it wants to. And the regulatory oversight of it is supposed to say, no, you have to be safe. You have to make sure you're not going to hurt people, right? They have a responsibility for a different area, a different domain of focus. And that creates tension, right? So there's always should be some tension. If there's zero tension between the regulatory agency and the companies they're regulating, they're not doing a good job regulating those companies, right? And so we've had, I think, a very sympathetic regulatory oversight regime. And I think it still is, really, when you think about it. Basically, SpaceX launched without a full license when they did their first Starship test. And they were able to launch again like a couple weeks later. So most times a company would not ever get to that opportunity again, right? Because they have to assert their mandate over that. So you can see people, I think, who are big SpaceX supporters be frustrated at that. But again, these exist for a reason, right? A lot of these regulatory agencies come out of early 20th century era where we had unfettered process of industries at the cost of human safety and at the cost of human health. And we, in a sense, live in this world now that has accepted and benefited from a strong public oversight regime, but we've maybe forgotten a little bit about why we needed it in the first place, which was to protect, again, look out for our interests. And so again, I think that's one of the core issues of that. And that probably would never go away, really, ultimately. But there are ways, of course, to streamline it. You don't want a regulatory regime throwing up barriers for no reasons or reasons unrelated to safety or that aren't realistic. And that's where I think you'll see this process has been refined over the years and always is valuable to reflect and analyze the rules we have and how we apply them.
Taking a step back, but looking at today, are there any areas of space policy that you think are underdeveloped that might need immediate attention by governing bodies?
Well, I think space policy in terms of how we leverage and engage it with industrial policy in the United States and with educational policy in the United States is kind of underdeveloped and ripe for reevaluation. In a sense, I think space policy can be seen as its own little thing off to one side, or NASA is doing something out there, SpaceX is doing something out there, and they forget that, it's all done here, right? You build the spacecraft here, you get the parts here, you train the people here, at least for the time being, right? And we, the decisions you make in space can actually be a part of a national industrial policy, skilled manufacturing policy, educational policy, and those can intersect in a lot of really interesting ways. We have public universities all over the country who receive basically kind of not really backdoor, but kind of like subtle government investment through overhead that they are charging government grants that support scientists and engineers. That's a really important source of operating funds for universities that helps, minimize costs in a lot of other areas. You don't have any kind of organized policy around supporting public educational systems that way, or any other kind of educational systems. And so I think space can be seen as a very powerful tool of a lot of other areas of domestic policy, and also has the advantage of that it's not politicized in the same way that a lot of other areas of policy are. So, right, there's no strong ideological Republican Democratic positions on space, right? There's nothing, and kind of in everything else has basically become ideological. And space may eventually reach that point, but right now it's not, which is great. And so you have a lot of opportunity for old school politicking and compromise in the area of space that you don't have in a lot of other areas. So can you make space policy that also, again, impacts industrial policy, that also impacts education policy, but in the guise of focusing on a space investment? Look at something like, again, you want to go back in history, Apollo at its peak, right, was engaging around 400-ish thousand full-time employees in the United States. And if you do the numbers, it's something like 2.5% of all of the adult working force age in the country at its peak. That's huge, right? That's like a lot of people. And so you could do Apollo-specific decisions that would actually have really widespread impacts on the industrial base, for example. And so if you can ramp up the footprint, in a sense, of NASA and space exploration, or whatever aspect of space exploration that's private or not, you are actually starting to impact a lot of other practical aspects of national policy.
Yeah, those are some really interesting points I hadn't thought about before. Uh, the kind of nonpartisanship of space is definitely an interesting aspect of it. So, kind of focusing on politics for a second, by the time this airs, the Planetary Society's recommendations for the Biden administration will be live. We got a chance to kind of look through some of it. I'm wondering if we can just kind of go down the list and talk about the 5 points. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, I can start naming them, or if you want to,
I'll
you
read them
can go.
off
We
and
can do
throw a
address them in turn.
question. Yeah, sure.
Sure.
That's fine. So the first one is deepen our commitment to deepen our commitment to NASA's science programs. And so, just looking through it, one of the things I saw is you're trying to raise that from, 31% of NASA's budget to about 35. Can you explain the rationale for that suggestion?
Yeah. So NASA science, we talk about NASA as a uniform agency all the time. I do this all the time too, right? But NASA is made up of a bunch of different directorates. It's a ton of programs that do a lot of different things. It's one of the things that really has changed over the years from when they first began. And I think people don't realize, NASA's science divisions, they're incredibly productive, way cheaper to do science missions than human spaceflight, just because you don't need to bring something back for the most part, right? You can have a failure of a robotic mission. It sucks, but no one dies, unless something really goes wrong on the launch pad. And so the type of investments you do through these science missions, also, again, you're not just hitting on the engineering side, you're impacting the entire science community in the United States and beyond, really, right? And the more you can kind of, again, ramp up the footprint of something like the science missions, you get this huge output in terms of the data that you can collect, because, again, they're relatively cheap. So if you go from 31 to 35%, you're talking about an extra billion or so dollars of the, per year going into science and engineering focused work in the United States. And think of how many salaries that pays. I mean, the vast majority of costs for space missions are generally going into the salaries of people who are making them: managers, engineers, scientists, right? These are all highly skilled people. They're not cheap to pay, and they always grow faster than inflation, right? So you're never going to get economies of scale or economies of people tend not to get cheaper when you're highly skilled with a highly skilled workforce. And the only way you can save money is just have fewer people working on them, which is what companies like SpaceX and private industry tend to do. And so again, you can just, all this extra money is going investing in people. And so I think the rapid rapidity too that you can get turnaround and results from space missions is also really important. You send a robotic mission to the moon in a couple of weeks. You can build one in a couple of years versus human spaceflight, which takes literally a decade or longer at this point to really see rapid, kind of payoff from the investments that you're making. So that's just and again, we're also just a pro-science agency, right? The organization, the Planetary Society. And you can make, I think, a very profound, philosophical and ethical case that there is value in and of itself to learn more about the natural world that we live in, right? Because the natural world, we live in it, we exist in this. There is a value to understanding it better. So the more you can invest in science, you actually have an ethical obligation to better understand the natural world around us in the cosmos, and you can do that. Then you get all these other benefits too with science. So I think deepening science, and of course the Biden administration has said that they're going to be this big pro-science administration, and so to really emphasize the fact that NASA science is only right now less than a third of the agency's expenditures, and we can bump that up, and that's we consider that a basement level of, we can go more than a third. And again, you just get all these great things just kind of compound with that.
Awesome. So then the second point kind of overlaps with that first one, which is about continuing human space flight. And one of the things I thought was really interesting was you kind of definitively said 2024 is no longer possible. I think that's something everyone's understood, especially with some of the recent tests not going perfect. What do you feel is a realistic way to get back to the moon? Is there a year you have in mind, or is there just a process that you think we can be more realistic about?
Well, I think honestly, no one really knows. I mean, I would like to say the late 2020s, I think is realistic. But a lot of things still have to happen right for that. And so what we called for in the official recommendations that we need to do a really kind of rapid assessment of the program and then use that information to set like a realistic target for it. And maybe 28, maybe 29, maybe 27, not going to be 24. Right. And I think we just need to be honest about ourselves with that. I mean, we have to remember this goal was announced in the spring of 2019. That would have been a 5-year, when that came out, I did an analysis. The last time NASA or anyone had developed a human capable spacecraft in less than 5 years was the Mercury program, right, in 1958 through 61 or 62. That was a very different type of spacecraft, very different type of, everything right back then. And this is the same for SpaceX and Boeing and their Commercial Crew Program. It took longer than 5 years. So building a new lunar lander, getting everything in place and on time and ready in 4.5 years was already, let's say, charitably wildly ambitious. And now, of course, as you mentioned, we've had, SLS still hasn't launched, Orion still hasn't done its test. The money has not been coming in at the right rate to support a rapid lunar lander development program. We just have to be honest with ourselves. That doesn't mean we don't have to do it. It just means we have to be realistic. And I think the bigger point there is also, historically, a lot of times when a new president comes in, they kind of tear up the last president's human spaceflight plans. Human spaceflight's interesting when you compare it to science in terms of policy. There's no external forcing factor for human spaceflight in terms of driving agreement about what to do or where to go. Science, it's different. You have a process through the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine every 10 years for every major NASA science. A bunch of scientists basically get into a room, argue for about 18 months, and they come out, the metaphorical white smoke comes out of the chimney, and you get this thing called the decadal survey. And it says enough scientists, will agree these are the big questions in our field. And then they can generally agree, here's the priority types of missions that'll solve these questions. That agreement is driven by this external factor of the reality of the scientific state of the scientific understanding of the field, right? So you can't just pretend you don't understand gravity, or you pretend you understand, you know, you know, the early first 100,000 years of the universe, or pretend you understand the surface of Triton, right? Those are just open questions. And so that helps that agreement happen. Human spaceflight does not. Right? When it did, Apollo is a good example. We had the external forcing function of that. It was a great way to symbolize U.S. technological capability against the Soviet Union for a bunch of newly developed or newly emerged countries in the post-colonial World War II era. Once that external factor disappeared, the political agreement for Apollo disappeared. And for the most part, political agreement about what to do with human spaceflight disappeared. And so it's really easy historically for the goals of human spaceflight to kind of pop all over the place because there's nothing anchoring them to a certain direction. So we're encouraging the incoming administration. The plan we have with Artemis is actually, besides the deadline, pretty good plan, really. No reason to toss that out. We can actually continue doing it. It's got a lot of people buying into it. You got international partners buying into it. You got commercial partners buying into it. Totally doable. And there's not that much value to rethinking everything again, right? And I think that consistency for human spaceflight, which can take decades to get going, but once it gets going, human spaceflight programs can be really enduring. They just got to get through that kind of nascent development stage where they're very, tenuous and easy to knock off politically. But once they get entrenched, get something like the space shuttle. It was approved by Nixon in 1972 and had its last flight under Obama in 2011, right? So that's nearly a 40-year program once that was going. And so we don't see any big reason to change the current conceptual approach Moon to Mars, developing a long-term approach to lunar exploration, integrating a lot of different partnerships and opportunities to expand the pool of people who are interested in going to the moon. That's how you build something that's ongoing and sustainable, and we don't need to tear that up and start again.
Okay, yeah. I hear what you're saying. That's actually when Bridenstine came to Michigan, November of 2019, and that question came up of, what happens if this all gets torn apart? And a lot of what he said was like, I'm trying to build up enough momentum for it that it can't get taken apart if, something were to happen. So obviously kind of the hope amongst people I've talked to is that Biden is able to adopt it and, like you said, evaluate it, figure out what's actually realistic, but like take a lot of the groundwork that was laid and hopefully finish it off. So that's good to
Yeah,
hear.
and Bridenstine was a politician before he was NASA administrator, right? He was a representative in the House of Representatives. And so he really, I think that was actually really valuable. He understood that, and he understood the history. And actually, we just saw last week the White House press secretary, the new White House press secretary, said that the Biden administration supports Artemis conceptually. So that obviously we need a lot of details. What does that mean? But conceptually, that's a really good sign, right? They're not just going to tear it out because it was a Trump program. And so that's really important for that. And that's real credit to Jim Bridenstine for managing that and building that kind of bipartisan support for that in a very partisan period of U.S. history.
Yeah. So we probably don't have time to go through the other three, but I would like to do the third one, which is about taking active steps to protect the planet from dangerous asteroids and comets. That's one that there's a lot of movies about it, but no one really seriously considers it, and potentially we should put more money into it. So you guys are suggesting, like, I believe it was $50 million, right?
Extra. It's a pittance. It's nothing.
Yeah.
We can do so much with just a little bit more.
So
Yeah,
what would you do
planetary
with that money?
defense. Yeah, planetary defense is really an interesting problem because no one is against it, right? No one's pro getting hit by an asteroid. But it's a classic problem of the commons where it's everybody's problem, and so no one wants to take ownership of it. They want someone else to do it, right? So then they don't have to spend the money, and therefore very few people do it. So it's improved a lot over the years. In the report that I have a budget profile showing planetary defense, or what they called at the time NEO, near Earth object observations, just looking for them, used to get something like $4 million a year, which is that's actually smaller than the travel budget of NASA headquarters. It's incredibly tiny. It's grown into about 150 million a year, mainly because it's doing this mission called DART, the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, which is going to test slamming into and slightly modifying the orbit of an asteroidal moon called Didymos, around Didymos. But it's grown, and we can do a lot of ground-based observations. But we want to pop that up about to 200 million, which allows them to do basically a flight mission program. So DART being the first of many. So you're always having a mission in the works to go into space. So the next one, we should have a space-based telescope dedicated to finding near-Earth objects. And we have one on the books. It's been studied for 10 years. It's been endorsed by the National Academies, called NEO-SURVEYOR. Again, this is a no-brainer. It's a relatively affordable mission. It's less than $1 billion. It's $500 million or so. And it's there to protect us from getting caught by surprise if there's an asteroid coming to hit Earth. And we try to frame it in terms that it's like, look, this is kind of like COVID, right? Where we know these types of things can happen. They're unlikely that you can get a pandemic or an asteroid hit, but they're not impossible, right? So it's a low probability, high impact event. And we argue that there's no higher impact event than getting hit by an asteroid. And so we actually public support for planetary defense activities, very, very high when they're pulled. I believe the public is very aware now of the consequences of not putting in some groundwork before a low probability, high impact event can happen, right? And so we can say, look, what would we learn from COVID? We should be investing in basic technologies that can be really relevant. So planetary deflection techniques or asteroid deflection techniques. We should be on the lookout and looking to identify outbreaks before they happen. In the asteroid equivalent, that would be scanning the skies, trying to find the full population of potentially hazardous asteroids. And we should be ready with disaster planning and preparation and organization. So we're not figuring this all out ad hoc if something happens to be coming our way. And you do that by having a healthy program at NASA that basically has an internal organization behind it that's committing to regular flight programs, and then also doing a lot of public outreach education. And so, again, this is just I think COVID really tells us how important this kind of activities are. Obviously, we had the Chelyabinsk meteor bolide explosion in 2013. We have a large amount of NEOs, near-Earth objects that we know are out there but have not categorized that are 140 meters or larger. And we have a congressional mandate to find them, but we just haven't had the money spent to do it. And so this is, to us, a very straightforward thing. And again, if we bump this up to 200 million a year, which is our proposal, it's less than 1% of NASA's annual budget. It's tiny. So it's a very doable thing, but it's like we can't say it enough. And it's just one of those things where people think planetary defense, oh, is that a Department of Defense activity? Or, what are we doing? Is something with space lasers or whatever? Right? It becomes an issue of clarity and also of priority of how do we actually make something happen.
Yeah. Well, we'll add that to the silver linings of COVID is that I bet you it has kind of boosted the relevancy for like making the claim that we should invest in things that could have a large impact if they go wrong.
Yep. Yeah. That's a good reminder that they do happen.
Yeah. And it's not a quick process to build some sort of contraption to go out and move an asteroid. So.
Very good. And also there's a lot of stuff too. Like if you need, there's another great reason to have heavy lift launch capability, right? If you need to deflect an asteroid coming at you, you need to hit that asteroid where it is way before you're in its path, right? So you need a lot of throw capability to make sure you have a lot of orbital injection options to get you where you need to go in the inner solar system, right? So all sorts of implications come from having a strong planetary defense awareness and planning, that you make sure you have the infrastructure ready, as you're pointing out, to deal with it should the threat arise.
Yeah. Okay, like last 5 minutes now, Ross, do you want to do some student advice questions?
Yep. Do you have any advice for young people or students to get involved with space policy?
Yeah, so I think it depends what type of space policy. We've talked a lot about civil space policy. Obviously, there's national space security policy. There's space law. There's a lot of commercial issues, right, in terms of property rights, ownerships, flyover, bandwidth access. Fundamentally, though, I think it's really important to have a strong grounding in the physical sciences. So my degree was in physics as an undergraduate. And I just find that immensely helpful in terms of just training my mind to tackle difficult problems, to have an understanding of what is, BS when people propose an idea versus not. And so having some grounded sense of basic science and engineering, I would add to that too, is really, really important. And then for policy, I think being smart about take some political science classes, right? So understand how your government works. And that can be, you don't have to be in the US for that, right? You could be anywhere. Just understand how you represent, if you're in a representative government, understand how that system works. Understand and read the articles and law that is written about space, that it doesn't just fund things, but actually sets where we go and why we do it. And you start to put together kind of the motivations and context of what's happening. And I think it's also really important to also just that word of context, understanding context of why. If you don't like, for example, we go back to that quick discussion about FAA and SpaceX. If you were really frustrated that FAA was getting in Elon's way with SpaceX, it helps to understand the context, right? And it's not as simple of a discussion at that point. And you have to, so understanding the history and why we have these systems that we do and what their motivations are. And if you understand this kind of it's all this competing, sometimes intention set of motivations of different actors, of different people, of different abilities and awareness and roles, the system becomes a little more clear in terms of why it's doing what it's doing, even if you don't like it. So I think that really understanding some aspects of political science and political theory is important. And then if you really want to get into space policy as a career, you focus on that in your graduate work, whether as a master's student or as a PhD.
So we have one more advice question, but I guess is there anything else you want to cover before we get to that? Is there anything we missed in terms of your job, space policy in general?
Well, again, I think space policy and politics I think people tend to get frustrated at politics. Or dismissive of politics and dismissive of participating in it, either through lobbying or supporting organizations that, quote unquote, lobby or try to influence the outcome of legislation. But really doing that, you do at your peril, in a sense. And I think even if you want to be in a career in space, in space, whether it's a scientist, as an engineer, whether you're starting a company or working for an existing one, again, the government touches every aspect of space, whether it's through regulation, whether it's through partnering with companies like SpaceX, right? Half of SpaceX revenue comes from government, or just purely government, scientific exploration missions. It's your future career depends on the policy that gets made kind of now, right? If you're thinking about this. And so don't ignore it. And you don't have to become an expert, but, maybe engage with the person who represents you in politics and say, hey, I exist. That's always a good first step. I exist. I care about space. They only represent people to the degree that people participate in this system. And if you stand outside the system, it's not going to solve itself, right? There's an old saying that's it's kind of cheesy, but it's like, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And if you choose not to participate, someone else will, and you have no idea what they're saying or if you agree with them. And so don't ignore it and just make it a part of your awareness. And I'll plug, we have a free online course at the Planetary Society called Space Advocacy 101. Walks you through a lot of this background, how to communicate, how the government works, how budgets come together. And at the end of it, the goal is you're much more confident if you ever want to go talk to your representative about what you care about in space, right? You don't have to talk about our issues, but it helps you just understand basic kind of setup and makes you a more effective communicator that way. And so that's just really important for any future professional, is that it's a part of your portfolio to be aware of how this stuff works, because it really does impact you.
Yeah, that sounds like a really great tool. So that's just on the Planetary Society
Yeah,
website.
if you go to courses.planetary.org, you'll see it linked there. And it's free to sign up. You can take it at your own pace. Not that hard, I don't think, but it takes a couple hours of your time, and you walk away generally with a lot more context about how this stuff works.
Sweet. Okay, the last question is the one we always ask, and that's just your general advice for young people who are passionate about space. What would you tell your younger self? What do you tell young people that are coming up in the industry and in the space field now?
I think what it means to be in space, whether to participate in the industry or the system is much more expansive than it used to be, right? So, and I think a lot of younger people have probably already internalized this through seeing people like Elon Musk and others who are starting companies. There's an entrepreneurial aspect. You can participate in space. You can be a person working at those companies through PR, right? You could participate in those companies doing government relations, right? Basically lobbying government. You can participate in organizations like the Society, and there's a role for just about everybody. You don't have to be that kind of astronaut, engineer, PhD scientist anymore. It's great to be those, but it's competitive to be those, right? It's hard to be those. And there's a lot of ways that you can help space along without, kind of being in those classic roles. And so I think that's really exciting that space is growing in a bigger tent, in a sense, that more people can participate in it. And to not forget, when you do something, if you do pursue it professionally, to, if you love it and want to do something professionally, that's a kind of a risk sometimes too, right? Because it's no longer an escape from your job to read about space or to follow space topics and stuff. And so thinking about how to, in a sense, protect your passion when you do something every day. And that's going to be a little different for everybody. And it's not, weird to feel that kind of burnout or frustration. Everyone will have it. But protecting and nurturing your passion is so important because it gets you through all the bullshit of doing anything every day. And your passion is just such a precious thing because it's yours and it motivates you and it energizes you. And when something pays off, right? When you're in a moment where you're a culmination of your passion or you're just doing something you just truly love, that's what'll stick with you. And for people who go into fields and let that passion die or let that passion be snuffed out by other frustrations, it's the daily frustrations of things, they lose that. And so I think that's an important thing to remember is like, if you love something and want to do it professionally, just find a way to protect yourself and protect that as you go through it, because no job is free of stuff you have to deal with. And I think you don't get to leave it behind in the same way for people who just clock in and out of something they don't really care about. So it's a blessing and a curse to do that. And just being aware of that and working that into your routine is really important.
Yeah, I think that's a really unique point and something that hasn't been mentioned often on here. So I appreciate you talking about that. It's something to
Yeah.
consider for
Anyone who
sure.
says they haven't ever felt that, they're totally lying.
Yeah,
Like and that's not, it doesn't like condemn anything. It's just the reality of living, right? Is if you
yeah,
do something every day, there's going to be frustrations and just people, right? And yeah, so it's really important. It's okay to feel that way. And I think finding a way, my wife, by the way, she's a professional scientist who works in space science missions, right? She's had to deal with that too. And her colleagues have had to deal with that. How do you exist and protect what you care about? And it's a great privilege to be able to do that, but it's still something you have to nurture.
yeah. All right, well, let's wrap this up. Thank you, Casey, for coming on. It's really interesting to hear about all this stuff, especially since Ross and I are engineers, and in school we don't always get the inside scoop on what's going on. So this has been awesome. Where can people find you on social channels and such?
I'm pretty easy to find, so I'm on Twitter, Casey Dreier. It's two E's around the I, Dreier, or just planetary.org. It's all linked to from there. You can find me there. I have a monthly newsletter at planetary.org/advocacy if you want to follow this stuff. I also do a monthly podcast called Planetary Radio Space Policy Edition. So if you liked hearing my voice on this podcast, I have it every month ad nauseum. But I tend to have a lot of guests who focus on, I drill down into a lot of the wonky aspects of space. And that's all on all the normal podcast distribution channels. So you can find me on there.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Casey. Thank you, Ross. Hope everyone has a good evening, afternoon, morning, whenever you're listening to this. And we will see you next time.